How come? Am I in the right spot now?
Mm-hmm.
We get started? Okay. Hi, welcome. My name is Darlene Ault, and I'm here today to talk to you about differentiated instruction. I'm going to start today's presentation with a quote from Albert Einstein. Einstein said that everyone is a genius, but if we judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. This is why we are having this in-service today, is because we need to look at our students the same way. We need to differentiate instruction to meet the needs of all of our students so they never feel like they're not capable of being that genius. We need to make sure that we meet them where they're at and look at their abilities and gauge what we're doing based on them to make them successful. Today's focus in our meeting today will be looking at the meaning of differentiated instruction, the rationale and principles behind it. We'll also look at different ways to differentiate the curriculum. We'll look at specifically how the process section is differentiated. And then we'll also look at next steps, what we'll be doing following this presentation. Okay? So first, let's look at the definition of differentiated instruction. Differentiated instruction is doing what's fair for students, taking a look at their individual pathway and making it possible for them to access everything, making it at their level, bringing them into their learning, and making sure that it's appropriate for them. The rationale behind differentiation is that we have students that come in with different levels of readiness. We know that not everyone comes to us with the same bag of tricks. Some come with higher levels in different areas. So we have to be aware of those things. Students come to us with different interests. If we tap into their interests, we'll gain momentum in their learning. They also come to us with different ability levels. We know that not everybody has the same ability level in every subject area. Maybe some students do better in math and some students do better in language arts. They all have different gifts and talents that they bring, so we need to accentuate those. They also come to us with different cognitive needs, which means that sometimes our students do come in at higher levels than other students, and we need to tap into where they're at so that we can meet the needs of that GATE student as well as that student who's maybe on the spectrum. So we need to meet all of their needs. Okay. There are 3 general principles that we need to look at. The first is instruction must focus on the essential principles and skills they need to know. We need to set goals and know what our student outcomes are before we decide how we're going to teach, and then we need to differentiate based on those outcomes that we are desiring. Next, we need to recognize and attend to the differences of the learners in our class. We have different learning styles, we have different learning abilities. Everyone comes different, and we need to address the different package they come in. We also need to watch our assessments, and we need to make sure that our assessments are ongoing. We need to assess to make sure that we're meeting those needs, and if we're not, we need to change the instruction to meet those needs so that we can reach our outcomes and our goals. Okay, so now let's look at how teachers can differentiate in the classroom. There's 4 basic ways we can do that. We can do it with content, with process, with product, and with environment. And when we do this, we also do it according to how the students, what their learning profile is, what their readiness is, and what their interests are. So we kind of bring all those things together in our environment. We're going to be looking at each one separately as far as how teachers can differentiate, and then we'll have a focus area. Okay, so first, content. This is the material the students need to know that was decided by either the grade level or the district. What are the essential things those students need to know? So how can we differentiate the content? We can do this by having varied resources that are at that student's level, have the same information but at a different level. We can have audio and video pieces that we share in class. So maybe if a student needs extra help or needs to hear the information again, we make an audio tape, or we video the lesson so that the kids or the students can see it again. Another way to do this is to highlight vocabulary with the students so they know what vocabulary is essential, and then you can expand on those vocabulary words, giving more meaning to those words for students. You can have interest centers for students so that you can capture their interest in whatever the content is that you're teaching. You can also have mentors come into class and bring information. They can either be peers or they can be adult mentors, and they can bring in information that maybe the teacher isn't able to bring in, or they can bring in others that can relate that information to the students. Okay. The next one is process. This is the way a student learns the material. So we know that students don't learn everything in the same manner, so we need to actually have alternative ways to teach it. So some ways to differentiate that would be having leveled or tiered activities. We might have interest centers based on what their needs are. Hands-on materials, ways to pace our material differently. Maybe one student is moving through the process slower than another. We need to allow for that time for them. We can have students work in partners, in tryouts, or in small groups when they're working on the process. We can also allow for alternative strategies, which we all know we do this. For instance, at our school, you know that we're working on 4 different ways to look at a multiplication problem. So it's important to actually bring those in. So if they don't get it the traditional way, you bring in other ways for them to learn that content. Okay. The next thing to focus on is product. This is how the student will be assessed that they've learned the material. So the product could be different for each student. We know that some kids test well and can do a written test well, and some kids can't, but they still know the information. So we want to give them alternative ways to have a product to show us that they understand the material. Okay, so ways we can differentiate this would be having tiered choices in what the student does to show that they have understanding. For instance, maybe if you are wanting them to show that they understand how to find figurative language in something, maybe they can verbalize to the teacher what the figurative language is. Or maybe you have a written test on figurative language for other kids. Maybe some students would act it out. So it could be different for all different students. You could also have students model and do stuff with technology. Students can have choice activities where they actually maybe come up with their own way to show it. Another thing is to bring in art into that. They can show it through a very artistic way. The last way to do it is in the environment. What does the space look like that these students are learning in? The environment needs to be different for different students. For instance, maybe one child likes it quiet all the time and the other student does better when music is playing. So we'll look at ways that you can differentiate the environment for students. So one of the ways to do that is have varied seating. So in a classroom, maybe you have bean bags for kids to sit on. Maybe some kids sit on the floor. Maybe some stand in the back. Maybe you have stools with no backs, or you have chairs that have wheels. Just different ways that students can sit in the class to feel comfortable. You might have students work with small groups or independently, depending on their learning needs. Music playing in the classroom, and then if you have that student who doesn't want music playing, you have canceling headphones for them. Another thing to do is to allow movement in the class. Some students need either a break of what's going on in the class, or sometimes they need to be able to stand and move to be able to process the information. There's also the idea of a flipped classroom where you have a videotape that the students watch at home that has the instruction, and then you work on that in class and work on the actual process of doing the work. They've already learned how to do it, and then you work through the process with them in class. So those are alternatives in the environment in the classroom. Okay, so today we're going to just focus on the process part. So we've mapped out the 4 parts. Now we're going to look at just the process part. So we're going to look at 3 aspects of how to differentiate the process. We're going to look at leveled or tiered. We're going to look at hands-on materials, and we're going to look at interest centers. So the first one we're going to look at is how to level or tier the work in the class. So let's say that we're working on different levels of complexity of text. So maybe we're studying the same content in social studies, but we have a student that reads at like 2nd grade level, and then we have a student that reads at 5th grade level. So we need to take into account both of those areas and the differences in their reading ability, and we need to have text that matches that, but we need to have the content be at the right material that they need. So maybe we have 2 passages on the gold rush, and one is written at 2nd grade level talking about how people mined, and then you have one at the 4th or 5th grade level talking about how they mined, and it would just have higher level vocabulary, but the information would be the same. So that's one way to do it, is have varied text. Another way would be to have a different pacing in the learning. So maybe if you had your students in a small group that maybe read a little bit slower, you would read a different text with them and read it at their pace. And then maybe you have an independent group who reads the text at their own pace, all on their own. Another thing to do would be moving from concrete to abstract. And this is very evident in mathematics. Maybe you start with manipulatives to do the work, and then you move into a more concrete, from concrete manipulatives to an abstract. So that way you can have them be able to see it and then be able to do the work. So the next one would be looking at hands-on. So with hands-on material, this would be bringing into the classroom materials that bring it alive for them. So things that they can do and they can actually see and feel it. For instance, when we talk about rocks in class, we bring in rocks and they look at them, and then we also do experiments that are hands-on that show them how the process works, how one rock changes to the other. So that would be differentiating the instruction, the process of how they learn about rocks. Another thing that, would be that this could be done with all subject matters, from social studies to science to math. Everything can be done hands-on. The last one is interest centers. Now, if you have students' interests in mind, often they're more engaged in what they're learning. So maybe you have students that are really interested in certain parts of California history, and they want to go learn about like the gold rush. So they'll go read a bunch of different texts and then maybe create something to share with others. Maybe you have a group of students who are really interested in the human body, and they're going to share and look up and research about the human body. And then they have to write about it in like a presentation. So this allows students to have their interests and still be doing content skills, and then the process level is at their own pace. So those are 3 different ways to differentiate the process. Okay, so closing here, we're going to look at what differentiation is. Differentiation is always looking at best practices in class. It's always student-centered. It always brings in multiple approaches to look at something. There are always multiple activities, but this doesn't necessarily mean that there's an activity that's different for every student. Could just be a few different activities. And then it's always flexible, so there's always room for change. Okay, so what are our next steps? We're going to be looking at, before we move into our next one, we're going to be working in our small groups with our grade levels. We're going to look at how we are differentiating the process within our classrooms. So as we meet weekly with our grade levels, I want us to look at how we're looking at the process and to see if the process, how you differentiated and whether it was successful, what things need to change, and how we can facilitate a better learning environment for the students. Now, as far as next steps for our whole group, we're going to be coming back together. We're going to look at more ways to look at how to differentiate product, how to differentiate the content, and then how to differentiate the environment. So we'll come back together as a big whole group and look at these things. And we'll also share successes we had that we shared in our small groups. Okay, the last thing I want you to think about when you are looking into differentiating the curriculum is fair isn't everybody getting the exact same thing. Fair is everybody getting what they need in order to be successful. So we have to look at differentiating as a way to make it successful for all students in the classroom. We want everyone to have the best opportunity. We want them to be able to shine in their gifts. Thanks. Oh, sorry. If you have any questions, here's my email address. You can feel free to email me if you have any questions. Thanks.